Okay, I want to talk about paradigm shifts. Now that we've talked about Plato's theory of metaphysical epistemology, before we look at René Descartes and David Hume, before we look at rationalism and empiricism, it's important to understand what a paradigm shift is. And a paradigm shift is a major change in how we look at something. This can be in science, society, philosophy, it can be in anything. Change usually has kind of a pop effect, like it just wham happened. It looks like the idea just popped, although there's a process behind that pop. So, and the age of empiricism was literally one big paradigm shift, an extreme paradigm shift. A paradigm shift of science and the church prior to the shift being simultaneous and one, to where after the shift we found it acceptable, or society found it acceptable, to allow science to function on its own and experimentation to function on its own, kind of on a parallel line to science, or on a parallel line to this church. And to understand that, you have to understand different paradigm shifts, and sometimes when we're in them, we're in one right now. We're in the age of technology, or a technological paradigm shift. They could happen, and they happen kind of right in front of your eyes. I'm going to give you a few examples. The Reformation. Now, the Reformation happened in 1517, and the Reformation, of course, is where Martin Luther broke from the Catholic Church. Let me see if I can get this right. Sorry. Well, thought I had it all figured out. There we go. Okay, so the Reformation, information is now for everyone, is really what the paradigm shift is. We think of that as being a religious change, and it was, but more than that, it was an information change, because the invention that brought about the Reformation was the printing press. Because prior to the printing press, you just didn't have that many things in print, and for a Bible to be in print, it took a monk several years to make a copy. I mean, in a monk's career, if you could write us half a dozen copies of the Bible, that was a pretty good career. So, it's just and then when the printing press came along and you could make copies, all of a sudden everyone could interpret Scripture, and that changes the way society looked at the church, because now you could interpret it yourself, and that kind of made a change from collectivism to individualism and self-interpretation. Both of those are very Protestant ideas, and the Reformation was an example of a paradigm shift. And there was actually maybe four. There was Zwingli, Calvin, Luther, and then Henry VIII in England. So you actually had four different kind of reformations going on all at the same time, in about the same time, in different parts of Europe. That was a paradigm shift. And like I said, the paradigm shift was more about information. Some people would say that was a predecessor, and I think that I'm in this camp, a predecessor to democracy, the idea that the middle class, or that the people that are common, can make their own decisions, rather than having the appeal to authority. So the appeal to authority would have been the church, and after the Reformation, you can interpret the Bible on your own. So that was kind of a paradigm shift on that. Now, that not everyone adhered to that. In fact, there was a lot of bloodshed over the next couple centuries over the Reformation and over that idea. But it all happened kind of quickly, around the mid-16th century. Now, the flat Earth, and there's two flat Earths. We're actually in another flat Earth theory right now, paradigm shift. But the first flat Earth theory was the heliocentric theory of Nicholas Copernicus. Nicholas Copernicus was a scientist who was able to prove that the sun was the center of the solar system, not the Earth. And Aristotle, back in the Greek philosopher Aristotle, believed that the Earth was the center of the solar system and the center of the universe. In fact, there was the Aristotelian universe. There's a picture, you can look it up, that shows the Earth in the middle and everything around it. If you go outside at night and you look, it looks kind of like the stars and everything all follow around us. and except for a few independent bodies that seem like they circle us too at a slower rate. That would be your planets, and they had them all figured out. And you can look on the geocentric theory. The geocentric universe has us in the middle, and then Nicholas Copernicus came along and proved that that's not true. And the church rejected that and said that it was that he was a heretic, and he actually had to serve house arrest for about 20 years of his life. And then Galileo came on a little bit later, and you actually could see it with the telescope. And then in about 1996, 97, the church actually pardoned Nicholas Copernicus. It might have been a little late. But anyway, the whole idea that the Earth is no longer flat was a big change. Because up to that point, I mean, the early people, Plato and Aristotle believed the world was round, but they didn't act on it. And then through the Middle Ages and the Dark Ages, there was this belief that the world is flat, and that and then we have the heliocentric theory versus the geocentric theory. So those two things kind of came together, and they kind of changed exploration, because now people weren't afraid they were going to fall off the Earth. So then they started to explore, and you had a few people like Columbus and that went before that. But after the heliocentric theory and the flat Earth theory was debunked, you had a lot of exploration. So that had to do with kind of a change in philosophy and a paradigm shift. The age of empiricism, and that's what we're going to study, that's just a theory of epistemology that led to physics as respected versus frowned on. So prior to this whole age that we're going to look through, and that's what we're going to be looking at. Some other things: the Industrial Revolution, machines came out of nowhere. Plate tectonics, that was one that was very recent, from the mid-'80s. I think the geologist's name was Wagner, that proved about plates on the Earth that are moving. That's still a theory. It's not absolute, but it explains a lot of things. And before that, we were taught in a different way. Our science actually taught us different philosophies about how different species of animals were similar from one continent to the next. Well, plate tectonics, explains that very easily. Another thing, this was a big thing, and I think I told you back on plate tectonics when I was in first grade, there was a chart that showed how the birds moved across the ocean from island to island, and that's why there's similarities in the northern hemisphere to the western hemisphere and so forth. And plate tectonics totally shows a different way that could be, and that's changed how we look at geology. The collapse of the Soviet bloc, and some of your grandparents would know about this. Maybe anyone my age and older would know about this. In about the mid-'80s, just all of a sudden, out of nowhere, the Soviet Union dissolved. And they dissolved into several little countries. And the idea of the Soviet system, the communist system, just kind of fell apart all at once. And Europe was back to one. And I've even got a part of the Berlin Wall, because after World War II, there was the Berlin Wall that was made between the East Germany and West Germany, and then that came tumbling down in the mid-'80s. And there was this foreign exchange kid. I was a principal then. There was this foreign exchange kid that brought me a piece of the Berlin Wall. I've still got it. But anyway, that just happened really fast. And then the flat Earth 2, the second flat Earth theory. And you can see what this is. In the old days, Mom said, "Bobby, eat your peas because someone in China wants that food." Or someone in India is starving. Now the wise mom says, "Bobby, try not to be wasteful and eat all your peas you choose to take. But if you don't eat them, realize that no one will starve, because starvation is a problem of distribution of resources, not that you don't eat your peas in the United States. But do worry about studying, because someone in India or China or Ethiopia or Kenya, they want your job." So that's the different way of looking at it, kind of, that we're actually back to a flat Earth technologically speaking, that we compete on a global market, and that's changed the whole way we look at things economically. So, people buy stocks. There's people that'll, stay up. They'll stay up all night and buy and trade stocks on the Asian markets. And before the internet, you had to go over there to trade stocks. So it changes the whole way we look at the world market and look at economics. So all of these things are different paradigm shifts and how we just all of a sudden change. In the age of empiricism, which we're going to go back and look at, I think it's definitely one of the greatest paradigm shifts, because historically you had your Greeks and Romans and you had a lot of philosophy, and then it kind of got lost in the Middle Ages. In the Middle Ages, or some people call them the Dark Ages, just kind of got lost. And then you had the Renaissance come, the Reformation first, and then, the Renaissance came in. There was the Low Renaissance, and then the Medium Renaissance, and then the High Renaissance. And anyway, and the Reformation kind of came towards the end of that period. But this whole idea was an idea that science matters, that individuality matters, that it matters what we think as individuals, not just what the church tells us. And there was this kind of a slow break, and the break was tough at first, and then the church started to accept it, because then the church started to embrace the whole idea of science being independent to search for its own answers. So, and that led to physics, and physics, of course, then Isaac Newton came along and had Newton's 4 laws, the Newtonian science, and he was actually very accepted by the church and very accepted by Catholics and Protestants both, and known to be a major contributor to science. Where prior to Copernicus, that would have been heretical. It would have been wrong to consider that there's theories that aren't given to us from Scripture. So it was just a different way of looking at things. So anyway, that's the whole idea of paradigm shifts and how we're always in them. Right now we're in a major one, the changing to technology and the internet and how we communicate. And I think you realize that we're in a time frame like that. 50 years from now, we'll look back on this time frame and we'll figure out what we actually did do. It's hard to understand a change that you're going through when you're in it. It's easier to look back on it after it happens. So anyway, that's the whole idea of paradigm shifts, just the idea that a major change in how we look at something. It seems like it just happens all of a sudden, but it usually is more of a process than it looks like. However, it's everything leading up to a change, and then the change just, bam, happens. So, and that's a paradigm shift. And that'll bring us up to kind of how this whole age of empiricism started to occur, because it started first with Plato, and then we went through all of this time period, and then you had your middle-aged scholastic philosophers, and they looked at everything from a God center. And then there was a kind of a movement away from a God center to a science as an alternative center or a parallel center. And Descartes struggled with that. Locke and Hobbes struggled with that. David Hume was one of your first empiricist philosophers who totally divorced metaphysics from empiricism, or divorced the idea of a priori set knowledge that was given to us from a divine source, versus that all we can really understand in the physical world is the physical world and what we experience through perception. So anyway, and that's that movement. So we'll go into the next section now. So, all right.